Welcome everybody to the Lenz lecture at Naropa University. I'm Andrew Schelling from the Jack Kerouac School, aka the Department of Creative Writing, Writing and Poetics. I want to not only welcome you, but remind you that upcoming is the 50th anniversary of Naropa University, and it's going to kick off this summer with the around summer programming and the summer writing program, and you can find all sorts of information online, and there will be flyers and posters and various things up and about that. So this is a very auspicious time. I'm also quite aware that today is the 37th anniversary of the Parinirvana of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and so for members of the community here, that means a great deal. In layperson's term, that's to say that that Tibetan Lama who founded Naropa, teacher, founder of various other Buddhist and educational programs, died this day in 1987. So an auspicious day. You're all seated on the Nalanda campus of Naropa University. Some of you may know a little bit of the history of Nalanda. It was a vast, monumental vihara, or learning center of North India, which in the 7th century, on the testimony of several Chinese monks who passed through, it had a large number of libraries, including one that towered above the clouds and mist, 9 stories simply to house Buddhist sutras. Now, for a brief Sanskrit lesson. Nalanda. Na alam da. Never enough generosity, or generosity has no completion. It is bottomless. I bet you didn't know that. That's what Nalanda means. So I want everyone to repeat aloud like a mantra. Na alam da. Na alam da. Na alam da. Generosity is bottomless. And on that note, I'd like to thank the benefactors of tonight's talk, the Frederick P. Lenz Foundation, which each year sponsors a dignitary of Buddhism, poetry, the arts, the psychologies. As I said, the pool of generosity is bottomless. The Nagas may stir it up a little on the surface, but it's actually very deep. The Lenz Lecture, which we're going to hear tonight, is an annual event sponsored by the Lenz Foundation. And the way we work it at Naropa is that the sort of host department rotates. So this has been about 12 years since the Jack Kerouac School invited a guest to give the talk, and tonight we have Bill Porter, aka Red Pine. So I want to just sort of think that this conjunction of Parinirvana days and the generosity that this campus is named for means we have all ripened our merit to the point that we get to listen to Red Pine read poetry and speak tonight. Bill Porter is the name he uses for his books of prose, which are sort of an amalgam of travel writing, investigative research, photographs, poetry, anthropology. Red Pine is the name he uses for his translation work. He has published about 30 books, mostly of translations from classical Chinese. He stands in a long lineage of translators who grease the wheels of real thought. Some of the better-known names, particularly in the Buddhist world, Xuanzang, Kumarajiva, Gunabhadra, who brought Sanskrit Buddhist texts and poems into Chinese, Marpa, the translator of Sanskrit into Tibetan, who may have been Naropa's teacher, and then many less well-known figures who worked Sanskrit Chinese or Tibetan texts into Japanese and around the world. There's also another lineage of translators, poets, particularly the modernists, Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, Langston Hughes, even filmmakers like Maya Deren, you could say, is a great translator of the modernist world. Translators are a curious lot. All of us who put our minds and hands to the work have to get familiar with intermediate zones, interzones. Biologically, you could say coyote or other omnivores and scavengers are those who wander the interstices between ecozones, between worlds. Culturally, minstrels, troubadours, clowns have always wandered the interstices. Politically, there are exiles. In literature, there are translators. On the borders, the great poet and translator Octavio Paz spoke of translation as being a world of echoes and shadows. Most people, it seems, think that it's a world of smoke and mirrors. But we translators learn that words have unstable meanings, that minds change. Even the minds of the dead continue to shift and revise themselves. So translation's a real Bardo realm, an in-between realm, between languages, even more between cultures. Old-time Buddha ancestors might say it is our karma. We may even be rebirths from previous eras and just simply rewriting the books we wrote centuries ago. Cold-eye modernists see translators as workers of world imagination, while extremist postmoderns see us as traitors. The Italians have a phrase, traduttore traditore, translator traitor. This train of thought sees translators as betrayers at our best, thieves at our worst. Yet the world of translation remains bottomless, like generosity, and red pine is an inheritor of both the two lineages I spoke of, the Buddhist and the modernist poet. He lived 20 years in Taiwan, first at Haiming Monastery, then moved to the farming village of Bamboo Lake and began work on translation with the poems of Han Shan or Cold Mountain. His many volumes of translation from classical Chinese include the four major sutras of Zen, the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, Platform Sutra, and Lankavatara Sutra, all with extensive commentary translated from the tradition. The poets he's translated include Cold Mountain, Han Shan, a name known around the world thanks to Gary Snyder and Jack Kerouac. Cold Mountain, of course, is the name of a man, the name of a mountain, and a state of mind. Bill has also translated Stonehouse, his personal favorite perhaps, Tao Yuanming, Wang Wei, Du Fu, Li Bai, most of the major poets of classical China. And uniquely, Bill knows the sites, S-I-T-E-S, associated with these figures as well as anyone. His book, Finding Them Gone, Visiting China's Poets of the Past, has 100 photos, 200 poems in translation. In form, it's a journal, and you can see all the sites, the graves, the mountain passes, the hermitages, the caves, the ancestral shrines associated with the poets. Why is all this significant? Elliot Weinberger writes, the great ages of poetry have been, not coincidentally, periods of intense translation. With no news from abroad, a culture ends up repeating the same things to itself. It needs the foreign not to imitate, but to transform. Or why is all this significant? Put it another way, Red Pine's Cold Mountain says, who takes the Cold Mountain road takes a road that never ends. The rivers are long and piled with rocks. The streams are wide and choked with grass. It's not the rain that makes the moss slick, and it's not the wind that makes the pines moan. Who can get past the tangles of the world and sit with me in the clouds? Last week I told Bill, pack your turtle fur hat and your pilgrim staff of rabbit horn. Two koan-like phrases from Cold Mountain. He wrote back that he would bring his Warple sword. Please welcome Red Pine with his Warple sword.
That was really good. You should publish that. That was. Thank you all for coming, and of course, thank Naropa for making this possible, and the Lenz Foundation for also bringing me here and financing this event. Thank you, and thanks everybody who's kept Naropa going all these years. I've never been here before. I've always wanted to come, but nobody ever asked. So anyway, thanks for asking. And every time I read Chinese poetry, I have to smile because I have no business doing this, or never had any expectation to be doing this. When I got out of the Army in '67, I went to Santa Barbara and studied anthropology because I was thinking, well, if I live this life, I'd like to find out how other people live their lives and maybe choose one. So I thought anthropology would be a good way to do that. And when I got ready to graduate in 1970, I didn't really want to go out and get a job, so I decided to go to graduate school. And the best department I knew of was Columbia. Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, great faculty then. And so I applied to Columbia, and I didn't have any money, but so I had checked all the financial aid boxes, and there was a language fellowship. And you had to be an American. It had to be a rare language for an American in 1970. And I just read the book The Way of Zen by Alan Watts, and it had Chinese characters in it. And I couldn't believe anybody could read the Chinese characters and understand them. So just on an absolute whim, I wrote in the word Chinese. And about a month later, they gave me a 4-year fellowship. I was a real fraud, and I had no interest in Chinese or Chinese culture, but I liked that Zen stuff, and so I went to Columbia, and when I was in New York, I met a monk, Chinese monk in Chinatown, and taught me how to meditate. And in the course of 2 years, I've decided this is a better way to spend my life than getting a PhD. So I quit, lived in a monastery in Taiwan, spent 4 years, 2 monasteries, but didn't really want to be a monk because I have an authoritarian problem. And I moved into a farming village for 14 years. And then just as I was getting ready to leave that last monastery, the abbot gave me a book he had helped finance. It was the poems of Cold Mountain. So I'd heard about Cold Mountain, but here's the abbot giving me his poems in my hand. And I couldn't believe it. And he even said, maybe you want to translate some of these. and so here they are. I'll read some Cold Mountain poems. And incidentally, there's a few things about Cold Mountain, I should say. We know nothing about him, just about nothing. A few people saw him and made notes of it. He flourished around the year 800. He was probably, there had been a big revolution in China in 755, and he had apparently, I figure, acted as in some form of help to the rebels, because he's the only significant poet in all of Chinese history whose name we don't know. So he was on the lam, and he ended up at the foot of this mountain called Qiantaishan, about 200 miles south of Shanghai. That's where he found a cave and named it Cold Cliff. And these are some of his poems. He was a hermit, and he was a representative of the really ancient tradition in China. As soon as Chinese civilization began, it already had hermits. And one of the early legendary emperors of China wanted to hand his throne to this hermit named Siyo. And Siyo refused to accept it. In fact, he not only didn't accept it, he walked down to the stream to wash out his ears so those words still would not leave any dirt in them. And there was another hermit standing next to him. He says, well, now you've polluted the stream. So this was the attitude people had, and there's a little story here in this Cold Mountain poem at the end. Born 30 years ago, I've traveled countless miles along rivers where the green rushes swayed, to the frontier where the red dust swirled. I've made elixirs and tried to become immortal. I've read the classics and written odes, and now I've retired to Cold Mountain to lie in a stream and wash out my ears. His poems, somebody collected his poems, and they were among the very first books ever put into print in the world. Around the year 1040, exactly in the year 1040, somebody made a woodblock edition of his poems. And within a few years, the Prime Minister of China did a series of 20 imitations of Cold Mountain. So he gained a reputation very soon after he wrote these poems. I reached Cold Mountain and all care stopped. No idle thoughts cluttered my mind. Nothing to do, I write poems on rocks, trusting the current like an untied boat. Some people say he wrote on monastery walls too. He would write wherever there was room. And his poems he was one of the first poets in Chinese history who wrote in the vernacular. His poems were meant to be understood. They weren't fancy, so direct. And he often wrote about the Dharma, of course. There was always some Dharma in his poems. Here's one about Tentai. He lived at the foot of Tentai. And Tentai was one of the major Buddhist sects in China during the Tang. And Tentai had a special meditation technique, which he describes in this poem. Spring water is pure in an emerald stream. Moonlight is white on Cold Mountain. Silence thoughts, and the spirit becomes clear. Contemplate emptiness, and the world grows still. Here's a poem about the three poisons. Anger is a fire in the mind. It can burn up a forest of merit. If you're traveling the bodhisattva path, forbearance keeps anger away. People ask the way to Cold Mountain. The roads don't reach Cold Mountain. In summer, the ice doesn't melt. Sunny days, the fog is too dense. So how did someone like me arrive? Our minds are not the same. If they were the same, you would be here. The people I see in this world walk dazed in the dust of the road, unaware of where they are or how to find a way out. Their bloom lasts how many days? Their loved ones aren't close long. Even if I had a ton of gold, I would rather be poor in the woods. He left about 300 poems. These are just a few. I go down to the stream to watch the jade flow, then back to the cliff to sit on a boulder. My mind is like a cloud resting on nothing. What do I need in the faraway world? Old and sick, final years, over 100, face tanned, head white, content with mountain life. Hemp robe, pulled tight, I accept my karma. Why would I envy the clever ways of others? In 835, somebody met him when he was over 100. So some people think he lived to be around 120. He had two friends that he was really close to, Big Stick, Fenggan, and Pickup, Sherde. Fenggan was a monk, and Big Stick was an orphan who they found on the road and brought to the monastery, and he spent his life in the monastery. So they all became pals. back in about 100 years before this time, there was a transmission of the Dharma from the 5th patriarch of Zen to the 6th patriarch. And there was a competition about writing a poem. And the leading disciple of Huineng at the time wrote a poem on the wall. The body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a standing mirror. Try to keep it always clean. Don't let it gather any dust. So when Huineng saw this, and Huineng was supposedly illiterate, he made a poem of his own about how denying every single line of that. And Big Stick wrote a poem too. Actually, there isn't a thing, much less any dust to wipe away. Who can master this doesn't need to sit there stiff. Here's another Big Stick poem. Whenever Cold Mountain stops to visit or pick up, pays his usual call, we talk about the mind, the moon, or wide open space. Reality has no limit, so anything real includes it all. And here's a couple of pickup poems. For a ball of mud and water, big plans make no sense. For a fragile, that's one of my friends putting that on his tombstone. For a ball of mud and water, big plans make no sense. For a fragile, dreamlike body, 100 years are rare. Unable to ponder deeply and claiming they're immortal, people steal a ton of gold, then leave it all behind. Woods and springs make me smile. No kitchens smoke for miles. Clouds rise up from rocky ridges. Cascades tumble down. A gibbon's cry marks the way. A tiger's roar transcends mankind. Pine wind sighs so softly. Birds discuss sing-song. I walk the winding streams and climb the peaks alone. Sometimes I sit on a boulder or lie and gaze at trailing vines. But when I see a distant town, all I hear is noise. So that was Big Stick, Pickup, and Cold Mountain. When I was translating Cold Mountain, and I didn't know how to translate. I mean, I don't think anybody who first starts translating knows how to translate. They just really love something in this language that they want to bring into say English in this case, and so you try. And I was just messing around, I guess, but I really wanted to do this because I love these poems. Eventually, I sent them off. I think I had maybe 50 of them done, and I sent them to Shambhala. And I got this really nice note from Sam Burkholz, how he really admired this, but there was really no market for this. And so I didn't know what to do with them. So this Australian friend would come up to this farmhouse I was living in once a week, and I was helping him translate a Qing Dynasty martial arts text, an I Ching form. And he said, "Hey, you've got all these books on your shelf by John Blofeld. Why don't you ask him what to do?" And I thought that was odd, because how you write an author? And I did. I wrote to John, and a month later I got a letter from him. He said, "Why don't you send me some of your poems or translations?" And I sent him 10. A couple weeks later, I get them back covered with his notes. "Send me 10 more." And this went on for over a year, and until I finally translated all of them. While I was going over, when you translate, you go over, there's no end to the number of drafts you make. But when I was about halfway through, I met this American who heard about me in Taiwan. He knocked on my door and said, "I hear you're working on Cold Mountain. Do you need a publisher?" I said, "Yeah." So he introduced me to an actual publisher, Copper Canyon in Port Townsend, that published Cold Mountain in 1983. So I actually got it published. But Mike looked at my translations and said, "Bill, when you translate a poem, you have to make a poem. And believe it or not, I didn't get that. I was, words, English, Chinese words, English words. I tried all kinds of things that were, dead-end techniques. Like, well, Chinese has so many syllables, English has so many syllables. Or these words are stressed, these words are stressed. And so I tried all kinds of techniques. And of course, none of them were very good. And that first edition of Cold Mountain, it really sucks. But 20 years later, Copper Canyon let me do a new one. And I had learned something about translation then, at that time. And once in 2004, there was a women's college in Boston called Simmons. And they held the first ever international conference on Chinese poetry. And they invited me and asked me if I would write something about how I translate. I never thought about it. Does Michael Jordan think about how he plays basketball? It's a muscle memory or a mind thing, mind muscle memory. But I thought about it and I came up with this idea. The way I translate, I see this woman dancing on a dance floor, and I want to join her, and so that's how I translate. I would never go on the dance floor myself, ever. So I don't write poetry to this day. I don't write at all. I translate. I love to dance with somebody who's already dancing, and I love the dance that they're doing. So I try to partner them, accompany them. That's to me how I translate, or my attitude towards it. That's why there's no perfect translation, because the word perfection doesn't exist in this realm. There's good translations and bad translations, nothing perfect. And every time you go on the dance floor, you're going to do it a little differently. And so, anyway, that's my comments on translation. But when after I published Cold Mountain, I thought I would do this other monk. Well, Cold Mountain wasn't really a monk, but this other Dharma teacher named Stonehouse, because I had discovered his poetry when I was doing some research on editions of Cold Mountain's poetry. I found an edition that had Stonehouse's poems right after his. And I couldn't believe how good his poems were. And to this day, I can tell you, if you asked 1 million Chinese, you would not meet a single Chinese who had ever heard of Stonehouse. Shi Wu Qinggong, nah, nobody's heard of him. He spent 35 years in a hut on this mountain, about 2-hour drive from Shanghai. Nobody heard of him. Although one of his disciples was a Korean who went back to Korea and founded the biggest Zen sect in Korea. So he had some very prominent disciples, and he could sure write a poem. The one night Chinese love to be together is the full moon night of the fall. It's called the Mid-Autumn Festival or whatever, but that's the night everybody tries to be together. This is a poem that he wrote one of those nights when he was alone. A thatch hut is lonely on a new fall night, with white peas in flower and crickets calling. Mountain moon silver evokes an old joy. Suddenly, I've strolled west of the summit. Someone asked what year I arrived. I had to think before the answer came. The peach tree I planted outside my door has flowered in spring 20 times. What's gone is already gone. What hasn't come needs no thought. Right now, I'm writing a right now line. The plums are ripe and gardenias in bloom. Trying to become a Buddha is easy, but ending delusions is hard. How many frosty, moonlit nights have I sat and felt the cold before dawn? Head of white hair, shoulders all bones. I've lived in a hut more years than I can count. My shorts have no drawstring. My pants have no legs, and half of my robe is missing. Not one care in mind all year. I find enough joy every day in my hut. And after a meal and a pot of strong tea, I sit on a rock by the pond and count fish. A few trees in bloom, radiant red. A pond in spring, rippling green. A monk with eyes that see beyond Zen doesn't have to be dead to use them. My hut isn't quite 10 feet on a side, surrounded by pines, bamboo, and mountains. An old monk hardly has room for himself, much less for a visiting cloud. People say everyday mind isn't our Buddha nature, but I say our Buddha nature is simply everyday mind. Afraid no one will do any work, they teach grinding iron rods to make needles. From outside my round, pointed roof hut, who would guess at the space inside? All the worlds in the universe are there, with room to spare for a meditation cushion. I built a thatch hut beneath tall pines, windows open on every side. All day, I sit facing mountains. Nothing else comes to mind. I sit and meditate in the quiet and dark where nothing comes to mind. I sweep in front when the west wind is done. I make a path for the moonlight. So, Stonehouse. They're published by Copper Canyon, like Coal Mountain is in an edition called The Mountain Poems of Stonehouse. Again, he wrote these around somebody collected these after he died, and they printed them in a woodblock edition 20 years after he died. And in this film that somebody made about my work, this film they call Dancing with the Dead, they actually filmed me going into the Central Library in the rare books edition in China and going through handling the only existing extant edition of the first printing of Stonehouse's work. Well, it was really a great honor. The Chinese have really loved his poems when he was alive, but everybody forgot about him. But otherwise, he'd be considered a great poet today. I think you heard those poems. Those were pretty good poems. The third poet I've got tonight is Tao Yuanming. Tao Yuanming died in 427, so different era. He is the poet most Chinese poets admire the most, if not all Chinese poets admire the most. And it's because of the life he lived, as well as his poetry. He came from a very, very famous family. His grandfather was a national hero. Anyway, he ended up becoming a farmer. But first, he tried to work as an official. He tried. And here's a couple. He lived along the Yangtze, right next to Lushan, the mountain, which was just south of his home. He called it South Mountain. And there's a word called a li. A li is a unit of measurement, 1/3 of a mile. So he's the title of the poem, in the 5th month of 400, held up at Guilin by winds, returning from the capital. Pressing ahead, retracing our route, I was counting the days to see my home. First, I'll be glad to wait on my mother. Then I'll be happy to see my brothers. Poling our way through a tortuous course, I pointed to the light fading in the west. What river or mountain isn't treacherous? A son going home thinks of what lies ahead. The wind from the south was disheartening. Stuck in a side channel, we shipped our oars. Surrounded by a sea of tall grass, what few trees there were far apart. Someone said we still had far to go, more than 100 li. Straining my eyes, I could see South Mountain. All I could do was sigh. People sigh about the hardships of travel. I'm just learning about them now, about the size of mountains and rivers and the unexpected dangers of both, about great waves that echo across the sky and strong winds that never cease. The more I travel, the more I long for home. Why am I stuck where I am? I've been thinking how much I love my garden, and why haven't I said goodbye to the world? And how long will my good years last? And why did I ever question my heart? Tao Yuanming. Well, he still got the job now. Traveling past Tukou at night while returning to Jiangling, where he was serving, in the 7th month of 401 after my leave. And there's a place named Jingzhou is where his boss lives. For 30 years, I stayed at home, ignorant of the world's goings-on. My loves were poetry and history. I had no ambition beyond my garden. Why did I leave it all behind for distant Jingzhou in the west, part from friends at the river, slap oars beneath a new fall moon? As a cold wind rose at dusk, the night sky was clear and bright. What glimmered in the vault of heaven shimmered on the surface of the water. Thinking about my mission, I couldn't sleep, still traveling alone at night. Court songs weren't for me. I'd rather stick with farming, toss my hat and go back to the village, not work for a salary or rank, cultivate something real in a hut, perhaps become known for something good. And so he finally did it. One night he just rode home. I was socially awkward when I was young. I preferred hills and mountains instead. Unwittingly, I was trapped in a net of illusions. I was gone for 13 years. But a bird on a tether longs for the woods, and a fish from the ocean recalls the old depths. So I cleared some land in the hills south of town. Choosing to be simple, I came back to farm. My property includes more than 3 acres. My thatch house is maybe 9 mats wide. Elms and willows shade the garden and back. Fruit trees spread before the door. The nearest town is off in the haze. Smoke hangs above the village houses. A dog barks in a distant lane. A cock crows atop a mulberry tree. There's no dust or trash in my yard. My house is empty, but filled with peace. No longer imprisoned in a cage. I'm back again, and I'm free. Here's one, an early spring of 403, thinking of farmers of the past. And he mentions the way, whenever the Chinese say the way, they're talking about the Tao. And Confucius was very famous for stopping to ask directions all the time when he went traveling, always looking, worried about getting lost. Anyway, teachers of the past left lessons. Worry about the way, not poverty. Considering this beyond my reach, I set my heart on manual work instead. I was glad it was time to grab a plow. I smiled and urged my fellow farmers on. The fields finally felt fresh air. Sprouts, too, thought of becoming new. Even if the harvest wasn't certain, the work was mostly a pleasure. The plowing and planting were done. No one stopped to ask directions. At sunset, after going home together, I troubled a neighbor for some wine. Singing a poem, I closed my door. A man of terraced fields for now. Now, this next poem is on reading the Book of Mountains and Waters. This is a fantastic book that dates back to around 1700 BC, but was finally codified maybe around 400 BC. It's a shaman's guide to the world, to all the mountains and rivers in China, and organized geographically. The eastern mountains, then the western mountains, north and south mountains, then the rivers, and all the creatures that live on these mountains, all the spirits. It's an amazing book. And also, there's another book he's reading in this poem called King Mu, The Tale of King Mu. King Mu was an emperor of the Zhou, one of the first emperors of the Zhou dynasty. He lived around the year 1000, maybe 980, something like that. He decided to go to Afghanistan and took an army of 50,000 soldiers, traveled to northern Afghanistan to see the Queen Mother of the West, to get the elixir of immortality. And he kept going, possibly to go to find the Garden of Eden. And everybody thought that this was a legend until in 500 AD, somebody opened a grave that was dated around 250 BC, and they found his journal, The Tale of King Mu. Just an amazing, amazing journal. One of my wishes has always been to follow his path. Teachers of the past. On reading the Book of Mountains and Waters. The first month of summer, and all that grows is tall. The trees have surrounded my house with leaves. Birds are glad to have a place to roost. I love this hut of mine too. Having finished the plowing and planting, I've returned to my books again. Such a remote lane doesn't see many ruts. It tends to deter even the carts of friends. Enjoying a cup of spring wine and vegetables from my own garden, and the lightest of rains from the east, and with it a welcome breeze, I skim the tale of King Mu and glanced at the pictures in Mountains and Waters. Having surveyed the whole world, how can I not be pleased? Here's another poem, exchanging poems with Liu of Jiaishan, one of his best friends, who was a hermit. Few people visit such a poor place. Sometimes I forget about the seasons until village yards are covered with leaves, and sadly I realize it's autumn. Even with sunflowers lighting my north window and grain nodding in our fields to the south, still I can't feel happy, wondering if I'll have another year. I tell my wife, bring the children. It's a perfect day for a hike. This is written in the 9th day of the 9th month of 409. The last traces of autumn. This is, I think Rome's being sacked right about now. The last traces of autumn have faded. A cold wind has joined the dew. The trailing vines have stopped blooming. Leaves are gone from the trees. Since the change in the weather cleared the air, the edge of heaven looks higher. Sadly, the sound of cicadas is gone, replaced by that of passing geese. The 10,000 changes are all different, as if our lives weren't hard enough. Since ancient times we appear, then vanish. The thought of this burned me inside. In order to relieve such feelings, I drank some wine and felt happy. I don't know about 1,000 years. Just let me prolong this day. Well, his most famous poem is this next one. He wrote a series of 20 poems, and they had added a preface to it. Drinking wine. Living retired, I have few indulgences, but now that nights are getting longer and I happen to have some good wine, not an evening goes by that I don't drink. Enjoying my own company, I drink until suddenly I'm drunk again. And once I'm drunk, I write a few lines to amuse myself. The pages have added up, but there's no order to what I've written. Just for fun, I asked an old friend to make copies. So this is number 5 of 20. I built my hut beside a path, but here no cart or horse. You ask, how can this be? Where the mind goes, I go too. Picking chrysanthemums by the eastern fence. In the distance, I see South Mountain, the mountain air, the sunset light, birds flying home together. In this, there is a truth. I'd explain if I could remember the words. The last 2 poems I'm going to read are his pallbearer songs. He wrote these 2 months before he died. He wanted to give his pallbearer something to chant or read, while they're carrying him out. Whatever is born must die. Sooner doesn't mean a lesser fate. Last night, like any other man, this morning I'm listed among the dead. Where did my breath and spirit go? Leaving a shriveled form in a coffin, children crying for their father, friends touching me in tears, never again to know success or failure, or to distinguish right from wrong. 10,000 autumns from now, who will know about my glory or shame? I only regret, while I was alive, I didn't get more wine. And then the second poem in this series. In the past, I often had nothing to drink. Today, my cup is full in vain. The spring wine has begun to ferment, but when will I taste it again? A table of dishes is laid out before me. Relatives and friends cry at my side. I try to speak, but my lips don't move. I try to look, but my eyes are blank. I slept beneath a roof in the past. I'll be spending tonight in the weeds. Once they carry me out that door, I won't be coming back again. That was Tao Yuanming. Really he, again, the reason why he's so respected by everybody is he's the kind of guy everybody wanted to be like. Because all of these people who, poetry, was, you had to be an official, you were examined on your poetry. You had to be a poet to be an official. So all the officials were poets. And after they'd spent some time as official, they wanted to be farmers. But like Tao Yuanming. But they just couldn't quite, But anyway, that's why they admired him so much. And why he's such a hero to many poets in China. And he was one of the first poets who really wrote in a modern idiom, and wrote in the five syllables to a line instead of 4 syllables like in the book of poetry. And without extra syllable, you can do so much more. And also it unbalances, it gives the line more directions to go, where you put the stresses and stuff. And I loved his poetry. As soon as I got to Taiwan, I encountered it. And I always wanted to translate his poetry. But I never thought I could, because 5 syllables, there's a lot in those 5 syllables. It's really, really hard to do that. I much prefer a longer line, more syllables to work with. This last poet, nobody's ever heard of, but he is incredibly famous in China for his poetry, but also for who he was. When he was 21, North China was conquered by a nomadic tribe called the Jurchens. And I think the Western historians used to call them Tanguts a long time ago, but anyway, Jurchens. And they took over North China, and the Song Dynasty court, this is around the year 1100, had to go south. South of the Yangtze to Hangzhou and Nanjing. And so he was in the north. And when he was 19, he and 54 to 49 of his friends formed a gang, and they started fighting the Jurchens. One of these members of the gang was a monk. And after about a year, they were invited to join forces with this larger force of 10,000 men, having much more success against the Jurchens. So they joined forces, and that night, the monk snuck into the commander's tent and stole his personal seal, and then rode off to the enemy camp, to the Jurchens. And when the commander found that out the next morning, he ordered Xin Qiji, that's the name of the poet, ordered him to come to his tent. He was going to have executed right there. And Xin Qiji said, please give me 3 days. I'll bring back my head, or the head of the monk. And so he got his gang together. They rode off into the enemy camp, found the monk, brought the seal back along with the monk's head. That's Xin Qiji. No poet in Chinese history has ever been like him. He was a swordsman, and he wrote essays on military strategy. But he also wrote essays on music theory. And when he was 23, the emperor asked him to come down and be part of their military operation south of the Yangtze. And he never went back north again. And then he became sort of a minor official, because he kept telling the emperor, we got to go north and we got to reclaim our territory. And they say, yeah, but things are good here. Things are good here. Don't be so excited. So when he was 23, Xin Qiji started writing poems. He'd never written poems before. And he stopped killing people. So I thought I would introduce you to Xin Qiji. That Tao Yuanming, poems from Tao Yuanming were published in October by Copper Canyon. The Xin Qiji will be published next March, so these aren't quite off the press yet. And what made me really think that this guy was somebody was when I visited his old home in North China, and they had a little brochure with 2 poems on it. And when I read those poems, I said, "This is some kind of poet," because he makes fun of his own art. What poet does that? Here's that poem that caught my eye by Xin Qiji. I didn't know the taste of sadness when I was young. I loved to climb towers. I loved to climb towers, and in my poems, I forced myself to speak of sadness. Knowing the taste of sadness now too well, I start to speak of it but stop. I start to speak of it but stop and say instead, what a chilly autumn day. And incidentally, these poems were all they're all lyric poems. He's acknowledged as the greatest lyric poet in Chinese history. He wrote poems to music, to melodies, just as if you take Bob Dylan's "Blowing in the Wind" and change the lyrics, and you would write 20 different poems with that melody of "Blowing in the Wind." And that's what Xin Qiji did. He would take these melodies. We don't know what they were. We know their names, but we don't have the notes. All we have are the words. This is a poem about a New Year's celebration and skyrockets. It's a description in the first two lines of skyrockets. And also, there's a line in this poem to show you the appreciation Chinese have for poetry. We have Google. The Chinese have Baidu 100 times from this poem, written again in the 11th century. In the east wind last night, 1,000 trees burst forth and showered down a rain of stars. Jeweled horses and carriages and incense filled the road. The tremulous sound of a phoenix flute, the transforming glow of a jade vase. All night the lantern swayed, and she, of the moth eyebrows and flower-decked hair, of laughter that beguiles, and the subtlest of perfumes, whom I have searched for in crowds 100 times, as I turned my head, she was there, where the lantern light was faint. So Baidu, 100 times, that's the Chinese Google. One of the birds you hear about in poetry a lot is the cuckoo, because the Chinese think, "Buru gui qi, buru gui qi." In Chinese, "buru gui qi" means better go home, better go home. So it comes at the end of the poem. Cherry blossoms on fire, lighting a whole trellis of snow-white raspberry flowers. Spring at its best. Bamboo shoots breaking through purple moss-covered slopes. Swallows leading chicks to test their wings. Zigzagging orioles courting new friends. Since spring was leaving, I asked if it could take my sorrows too, undo the 1,000 knots in my heart. I looked out from a tower at the ridges of newly greened hills toward my home beyond the mist. About my lifelong regrets, who could I tell? Butterflies can't carry a dream that far. Beneath the late night moon, a cuckoo called. I listened to its cries in bed, urging me to go home, but I can't go home. Before reaching the mountains, I turned my horse around. Heavy wind and rain, and no plum blossoms, or anyone to share a few cups of wine. Same as always, thinking of spring. No part of my body doesn't feel old, despite once wearing flowers in my hair. Chang'an is the name for the capital. I didn't take the road to Chang'an, and I've worn out my welcome at mountain temples, pursuing the pleasure of tasting the tasteless, passing my time training to be untrained. I preferred to be me, not some official. Having traveled the realm, I retired to farm. Pine trees and bamboo are my truest friends. Wildflowers and birds, my dearest brothers. Walking along a stream, I see my reflection. At the bottom of the stream is the sky. In the sky, clouds are drifting. In the clouds, I am walking. Who is that singing along with me, that pure voice from a deserted valley, not a ghost or a mortal, singing about peach petals in a stream? Peach Petals in a Stream is a very famous story by Tao Yuanming about a farmer who sees peach petals in a stream and says, there's no peach petals here, so where are they coming from? So he walks up the stream until he sees the stream coming out of this crack in the mountains, and he wedges himself through the crack, and he comes down into this hidden land where people are all living, wearing old-style clothes and speaking an ancient dialect. And he stays there for a couple of days. They entertain him. And he says, well, I have to go home. And he finally goes home. They said, just be sure not to let anybody know we're living here because we came here to get away from everything. He leaves stuff, marks the trees or whatever, tells the officials where the peach blossom spring is, but they never found it. So that last line, singing about peach petals in a stream, you see that a lot in Chinese poetry, about Shangri-La, the Chinese version of Shangri-La. There's a sort of in the countryside, there's a celebration, there's going to be a big feast, and the landowner is bestowing the bounty. The pines and bamboo had merged with the clouds. Everything that moment was perfect. The landlord was dividing the meat with his cane. The whiskey on the altar had begun to ferment. The dates in the orchard had felt the fall air. A child was stealing them with a pole. Not wanting onlookers to scare him away, the old man watched in silence. I've pieced together some lines from spring, unrolled a painting of a mountain and river, weightless gulls chasing empty boats, scruffy dogs welcoming a village woman home, bamboo and pines, hills turning green, traces of snow teasing the last plum blossoms until a gaggle of crows, devoid of appreciation, kick a crystalline shower to the ground. Who moved the mountains last night? Seeing nothing but clouds, I guess it was you. For the handful of peaks I usually see, I searched in vain along the whole stream. Suddenly the west wind whisked the clouds away. The pillars of the sky all reappeared. An old monk clapped and laughed at this show, happy the mountains were in their old place. I always wondered if Donovan ever saw that poem. First there's the mountains, and then there are no mountains, and then there are, whatever. Where lately are my sorrows? And where exactly are my joys? Feeling the chill of 1,000 generations, I let the vastness of the west wind take me. Into the bamboo to find a spring, into the clouds to plant a tree. For I am truly an idle man, and this idle mind of mine doesn't necessarily need a hill or valley. Don't tell me the past is all wrong and the present is right. For that, I turn to whiskey. And when I'm drunk, I don't know who I am. I'm not the moon or a cloud or a crane, the cold dew at the top of a pine or a cassia tree in the wind. Eventually, I become sober. But as long as I'm sleeping below the north window, please don't startle the birds. I rebuilt my hut in stages. My little window faces the mountains now. Having begun work last year together with the swallows. Let me read that again. I rebuilt my hut in stages. My little window faces the mountains now, having begun work last year together with the swallows. Due to illness, I've given up snacks and wine. With old age coming on, I burn incense and mumbled sutras. Last night, though, I listened to music again. He wrote this poem 2 months before he died. Everything is disappearing like clouds or smoke. My vitality is withering faster than a shore willow's. What am I good at anymore, besides drinking and wandering and sleeping? I've already turned over the taxes, also the income and expense accounts. Meanwhile, I'll continue to deal with the trifles, like mountains and rivers and bamboo. Spring wind was blowing and a wine flag was flapping. The sweet mash of a country store detained us. We tied up our horses at a lakeside temple. The pear blossoms were like snow. A monk tried to sober us up with cups of tea and perfumed foam. I vaguely recall the moss on the road home, waving my whip at spring scenes. Again, Mid-Autumn is the biggest celebration in China, and it always has been, still is. And cassias are sort of like a kind of a cinnamon with very small, white, fragrant flowers. I recall Mid-Autumn in the cassia grove, the flowers in my cup, the moon in my cup, tonight upstairs, the same cup, clouds soaking the window screen, rain soaking the window screen. I wish I could ride the wind to heaven and ask why, but roads don't go there, and letters don't go there. My room lit only by candlelight. I'm not rushing the cups. I'm not rushing the songs. A thatched hut, a grass-lined stream. The area around Shanghai, that southern 100 miles or two of the Yangtze is an area known as Wu, W-U, and the Wu dialect is what people still speak in the Shanghai, Suzhou area around there. And nobody in Beijing can understand it. I mean, dialects are that far apart in China. A thatched hut, a grass-lined stream, the charming, slurred dialect of Wu. Who is that white-haired old couple? Their eldest son hoeing beans across the stream. Their second son weaving cages for chickens. Their spoiled, utterly bored youngest son lying beside the shore, shelling lotus pods. Worldly concerns are waning again. The longings of fall are increasingly clear. When late night sounds still reach my pillow, I ask the stream if it can't quiet down. The moon looks brighter to those who are sad. The first rooster is always the one farthest away. If profit and fame mean nothing here, why are people on the road before dawn lights the hills? I loved spring as much as wine when I was young. I picked flowers on horseback and drank without restraint. Older now, I view spring like a hangover. Give me tea and incense and smaller window screens. After blowing away the last petals, the wind doesn't stop, not the longing. Flowers open so they can feel the warmer air. You wonder who sees where spring goes? The swallows. They meet it at sunset the day they arrive. And I think I have, a few more. Mountains aren't servants. Who doesn't love their unbending nature? When the year end turns cold, they tell me to stand. Note. The most famous poem in the Chinese language is by Li Sao, called Li Sao, written by Qi Yuan around 300 BC. And Li Sao means beset by sorrow. It's one of the longest poems in the Chinese language, because Qi Yuan was a shaman poet, always trying to get his king to do the right thing, but of course the kings never do. Mountains aren't servants. Who doesn't love their unbending nature? When the year end turns cold, they tell me to stand by the stream. Once the moon rises above the ridge and climbs high enough in the sky, night after night, it enters the stream and listens to me read, beset by sorrow. One thing I discovered, I wrote a book about a lot of the hill tribes in China, but one of the customs they had among another group of people who aren't really Chinese. They're Miao and Zhuang. For the marriage ceremony, they use these huge swings, where the woman sits on the ropes are at least 30, 40 feet long, and they really swing, usually across a small valley, like a small valley, like a gorge. And so with the Han Chinese discovered this in the Song Dynasty, they started using these swings, for fun. And elm coins is mentioned in this too. You know, the samaras, the seed pods of an elm tree, called elm coins, because they look like a Chinese coin. Aloof and wearing makeup, her eyebrows pinched and the thinnest of smiles, her silk dress clinging in the softest of breezes, her cloud-like hair with fake kingfisher curls, trees flowering in South Garden in the warmth of spring, pink-setted paths littered with elm coins. About to ride the swing, she hesitates and goes home, worried it's late. Hungry mice circle my bed, bats pirouette above the lamp. A heavy pine rain beats against the roof. Shredded paper panes chatter in the wind. Having spent my life on both sides of the Yangtze, I've retired dark-skinned and gray-haired. On a fall night, beneath a blanket, I woke from a dream, 1,000 miles of mountains and rivers before my eyes. Whether at court or in the woods, life is a dream. Don't be startled when you're praised or blamed. Pass your life somewhere quiet instead, with a wine cup in autumn filled with dew. A few lines at night, carved in ice. Do you remember that rainy night below my little window, happy in our beds, facing the lantern light? I asked, who was joining you on your 1,000-mile journey? At dawn, over mountains like eyebrows painted green. In autumn, down rivers clearer than a mirror. Startled by the moon, a magpie took off. Cicadas droned in the chilly night air. The scent of flowering rice promised a good harvest. I stopped to listen to the frogs. A handful of stars in the sky above, a few misty mountains ahead. The old wine store by the sacred grove, where the road turned. Suddenly, I saw the bridge. Last June, some local scholars took me to that place where that poem was written, to the bridge. It's amazing the memory of these poems. And if you go to a bookstore and you buy something by some scholar, none of this information will be in that. So I've discovered if you really want to understand the poems of somebody in China, you have to go to that village, that town, because local people have memories that never made it into print. Anyway, it's just something that I wish more translators would do. I think I'm down to the last two here. Two of the accoutrements of all officials were a carriage and a big starched hat. If somehow I had a carriage and a hat, I would still have to ask what such things were for. In towns once filled with nothing but sorrow, the wind and moon now guard the walls. Despite having reached the inner circle, I spend my days in wine shops, my head now covered with snow, singing this out loud to my fellow heroes. Why bemoan the withering of chrysanthemums? Rarer examples exist, like plum blossoms struggling to bloom. When I'm drunk, I wipe my eyes and look west. As a lone goose appears, then it's gone. I'm letting everything go, all the passing clouds. Getting angry would be a waste of effort. Where are my old friends? Venus is still keeping the crescent moon company. A good rain. One of the old celebrations in China is the third day of the third month, which in historical times has become grave sweeping day, usually the first week of April. A good rain and a proper spring, time to hurry home and plow. More importantly, it's purification day. Sitting by my little window, listening to the rain, how I hate when the moon comes at night. How I hate when the wind comes at night, when the moon comes at night, when clouds come at night. As petals fly by and orioles and swallows chatter, I worry this might interrupt my lakeside strolls unless heaven relents. But why confound my heart? Let it suddenly be cloudy, rainy, or clear. Those are all the poems I brought with me tonight, but If you have any questions. I thought maybe you had some questions, and I sort of raced through the poems. Sorry. Yes?
Were there any female Chinese poets?
Yes, a few.
Have you translated any of them?
Yes. Zhu Shuzhen, Xue Tao. I've translated a few, Li Qingjiao also. All of them appear in my book, Finding Them Gone. I came up with this idea to go to China and pay my respects to the graves of the 40 greatest poets and to visit their homes too. So I had applied to the Guggenheim for that, and my friend William Merwin actually wrote a letter to the president of the Guggenheim, so I got this Guggenheim grant. Yeah, he was, you're supposed to fill out a form. Merwin was supposed to fill out a form, but he just wrote his friend Ed Hirsch, who's the president of the Guggenheim. So I got this money to take this incredible trip to China and visit all of these places, which took a bit of research, but it was really neat to visit all the graves of all of these great poets. 3 of them were women. But it was really women, daughters weren't, some daughters were educated as much as sons. Su Dongpo's sister was. But usually, like, and Zhu Shuzhen, for example, one of the women I translated, when she died, her parents burned everything. Fortunately, everybody had memorized her poems, you know, so but that, anyway, they I mean, you know, I mean, there are more, today there are more women poets who are writing poetry. It generally tends to be more a male thing, though, even today. But maybe that's just the media who give more press to male poets. But anyway, poetry is still a big deal in China. It'll never have the respect it has here in the West. First thing you do when you go into a Chinese home, you see on the wall poems. Everybody, even if they're not your poems, you get a friend's poems, or maybe a Li Bai poem or a Xin Qiji poem. But
If there's any more questions, why don't you come up to the microphone, and that way everybody can hear the questions.
Oh.
Hi. I'm curious how the Chinese language has changed in all these hundreds of years. You know, we have Old English poetry, and it's very different than modern poetry. So how has Chinese transformed over the centuries?
So how did Chinese poetry change over the centuries?
And specifically the language, the Chinese language in poetry. Yeah.
Well, the only thing that's really changed are the dialects. There's been a big divergence in dialects. But Chinese poetry, nah. Well, see, they all memorize the poems of the past. And so that meter, that style, is imbued in the current. When there are changes, there's always old stuff in the new stuff. So Chinese poetry really hasn't changed that much. I mean, until modern times. I mean, because now they often. I mean, old poets never used the page as a frame. Like now, you know, in the West, we put words all over the page using space and context, visual context, as part of the poem. Whereas Chinese, it's just line after line after line after line after line. But now the Chinese are also publishing books where they break up the different lines and put them in different spaces, you know. But they're all using the same basic language, same. The characters, well, the mainland has changed the characters and simplified them, but no, they're not that different. They're just ugly. That's all. It's true. every calligrapher in China, or there is no calligrapher in China who uses simplified Chinese when they're writing something to give as a present or to put on a wall. They always use the traditional characters because they're beautiful. And they have a certain architecture to them. But so the graphic Chinese language has not changed, and except for the simplification in the mainland. And that goes back to around 300 BC, maybe even slightly earlier, when the bureaucracy, the Chinese bureaucracy, started putting down roots, and then they started fixing the shape of the characters. But again, the Chinese language keeps importing the old stuff and phrases. It's just like we'll use a Bob Dylan phrase or something from the Beatles or something. And they do too, in their language today. So, but what's really changed are the dialects. Because China is a land of dozens of dialects, and at least a dozen major dialects. When I interviewed hermits in China, and I used a tape recorder, and I took the tape recorder to the professional transcription service so they could listen and write it down, that I could read Chinese. 25% of my interviews, they couldn't read. They didn't understand. So the dialects are really far apart. That's one big thing. Well, anyway, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Would you read a poem or two in Chinese for us?
I didn't bring any.
Maybe something from Stonehouse. We have your book. If that
You got a book?
Yeah.
Well, where?
Play a game? It's right here.
Oh, and you happen to bring Stonehouse, of course. Okay. So. 百年日月见中度，把玩尘劳尽处消。绿水光中山影转，红如涛上雪花飘。100 years slip by unnoticed, 84,000 cares dissolve in stillness. A mountain image shimmers on sunlit water. Snowflakes swirl above a glowing stove. When I was first in Taiwan, between monasteries, I took about 6 months out, and I started studying calligraphy. And in the 70s, there were so few Westerners interested in Chinese culture, you could access all the great teachers. And the curator of the Palace Museum became my calligraphy teacher. And so I would see him every Saturday. I mean, I had no talent at all. It was definitely a dead end. But I have always admired calligraphy. I love it. But anyway, on one Saturday, I asked them, I said, I hear people, the Chinese, you don't read poetry. You intone it, you sing it. But how do you know? By looking at the page. He said, just a second. Went into another room, put a bottle of whiskey on the table. He said, this is how you sing it. You've got to feel it. So that's how you read Chinese poetry. You have fun with it. I mean, there are people who really know how to do it. I just screw around with it. And I haven't been drinking.
Thank you so much for coming to Naropa. I love the story of how you discovered Chinese as a language to work on, and the kind of twist of destiny.
You just check a box and your whole life changes.
My question is, you mentioned being a failure as a monk, and I was wondering how the hermit literature may have inspired your life, and if that might also relate to the story of your pen name, Red Pine.
Well, certainly the people who, when I first started reading texts of poetry, there were people. Coal Mountain and Stonehouse were probably my first two poets. So it was the poetry of recluses or people who spent time alone in solitude. So that was, resonated with me, and I was sort of doing that in monasteries, because monasteries are, when you enter a monastery, the world just disappears. That was a wonderful experience. It was really hard for me to leave the monastery. I probably never would have, but one day the abbot called me into his room. He said, I just got a call from the U.S. consulate. Your father died. And then a week later, I got a letter from my father, who never wrote me. He wrote me 2 lines. You know, you've been over there 3 or 4 years now. Isn't it time you did something productive with your life? So a couple months later, I moved out of the monastery to this farming village, where I also lived more like a recluse. But I still, for the first time in my life, I needed a job. So I had to teach English 3 nights a week, from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night. When people get off work, teach conversational English. So I had to take a bus down the mountain. And one day, the bus just happened to stop at this big billboard for black pine cola. And I said, that's the name I've been looking for. But black is a Japanese color. Red is the Chinese color. So I started using this name, red pine. I mean, in the monastery, I was Sheng Yun, I was Victorious Cloud. But I wasn't in the monastery anymore, so I needed, you know, a different name, not so victorious. and then about 6 months after I started using the name Red Pine, I discovered the first great Taoist in Chinese history was Master Red Pine. He was the reign master of the Yellow Emperor. And my experience with that is that, because I was just engaged in, I was translating then, obviously, so, and I was really getting better at it. I was about to send in the final manuscript of Cold Mountain, which still sucked, but I was getting better at it. And I began to realize that I have this relationship with something outside of myself. Because as a translator, I really feel you do have to stand aside. And because things would happen I have no way of accounting for. You know, understanding, open a book, there's the answer right there in the book that I'm looking for. So Red Pine is sort of the muse, you know, a connection. As a translator, where you pick something, a name that just to indicate that you're a little bit different when you translate. So, and I stuck with it for a long time until I was publishing the Diamond Sutra. When I came to America some years earlier, Gary Snyder had introduced me to his publisher, Jack Shoemaker, who had North Point and then Counterpoint. Jack was publishing my Diamond Sutra. Jack called me up one day and said, Bill, I've been talking to my marketing people, and this Red Pine thing, that's got to go. It's just too new agey. You know, we could reach a lot more people if you were Bill Porter. And so I said, well, okay, Jack, well, you know, I want to sell books, so okay. And then 2 weeks later, Jack calls me up. He says, I just talked to Gary, you're Red Pine. So I have Red Pine, thanks to Gary. So anyway, thanks for the question. Yeah, Randall?
Yeah, long-time listener, first-time caller. So recently, I want to say 2 years ago, I found your translation to Guide for Catching Plum Blossom.
Yeah.
How did you come across that? And did you get to see any of the wood blocks? And I don't know if anyone in the audience is familiar with that piece, but could you tell us a little bit about that, what it's meant to you?
Well, I was in China looking for hermits with my photographer friend in '89, May. And it was about a week before Tiananmen. And we had worked our way down to Hangzhou and sort of doing a day in the city. And they had some old bookstores, old books, stores with old books. And I found this string-bound woodblock edition of pictures of a plum blossom. And it just looked beautiful, and these poems I couldn't quite understand, slightly different kind of language. It wasn't Cold Mountain or Stonehouse language, it wasn't the Dharma. Anyway, I bought the book, and I took it back to Taiwan, and I happened to have a Chinese friend who's an artist. I showed it to him, and he was stunned. He says, my teacher's been talking about this book, but he's never seen a complete edition. And his teacher was a man that he was the cousin of the last emperor, And he was supposed to be the last emperor, but the KMT brought him back to Taiwan because they thought maybe the republican form of government won't work out and we could have an emperor. And this was the guy. And he was a painter. And he specialized in gungbi, in very fine painting. And my friend was studying with him. And so together they started looking at my book, and they told me more about it. And then me and my friend started every Wednesday. We would meet in his apartment. He had a little tea room, and we would look at these. And so what this is, it's a book. It was the first printed book of art in the world. It was, and only one copy of it still existed in the Shanghai Museum. And eventually I got a facsimile of that to use, which is even better than the copy I had gotten in Hangzhou. It's 100 pictures of a single plum blossom from the time it barely can be discerned as a bud until that last petal falls. And each was accompanied by a poem that was a description. If you saw the poem was describing the view, the shape, like maybe it looked like a turtle foot or something, or crow's head or whatever. But also the poem had these historical stories in it about the turtle foot or the crow's head or whatever. Just these lovely little poems. So 100 views of a plum blossom, 100 poems to go with it. Just a lovely, lovely, lovely book. And so I published it with my friend in Taiwan, wrote the introduction to it, Luo Qing. And it's probably been the book I've sold the fewest copies of. But I thank Copper Canyon for putting it in print and keeping it published. As you can go online, and it's a guide to capturing a plum blossom, because that's what, as an artist, you're trying to do. You're trying to capture the plum blossom, both as a view, in graphic, woodblock, black and white, and then the poem. Thanks for that.
Maybe you'll sell some more copies, because we know about it.
Maybe I'll reach a dozen this year. Thank you. Thanks, Randall.
Bill, there's a couple of questions that came in from people who are joining us by Zoom tonight.
Thanks. Thanks for joining.
Actually, that's what they say. First, deep thanks for your entire life's work, Master Red Pine. Your efforts have deeply enriched my and many another wayfarer's path. This is from Frank. How was your own mind melding, heart-mind melding with the verses of Taoist and Chan Buddhist influenced hermit poets? How has this shaped your own spiritual practice in the here and now of the red dust world?
I still didn't quite get the...
Yeah, okay, so let me try to bring it down to the basics.
Yeah.
The verses of Taoist and Chan Buddhist hermit poets, how have their verses shaped your own spiritual practice?
Well, they've definitely taught me simplicity and letting go, and they've been guides, and I feel like I'm following in their footsteps. They're pretty far down the path, but they're friends. As a translator, as I said, they're my dance partners. These people. That's what I learned more about them as persons too in the mountains. The distance from teacher students, that's not really much of a distance, and I never met anybody who emphasized that. They were just, because what they were delivering was something so heart to heart, mind to mind, and that it didn't matter what they said. I would feel that connection. So yeah, I guess it's kept me off the streets and from making money. Darn. Yeah.
Yeah, the money thing is always, yeah. Okay, here's Nicholas. I notice very similar themes between the Taoist Buddhist hermit monk poetry And these later poets you have read for us today, is there a clear demarcation between a poet pursuing the way and some of the other poets you have chosen to translate?
Okay, well, of course, the reason I went to China in the first place to find hermits was because I read Coal Mountain and Stonehouse, and I wanted to know if people like that really existed. At the time, I was working for this English language radio station the U.S. abandoned when we recognized China, and I was their local news director for a couple of years. And again, I applied to the Guggenheim. And I was interviewing this man who was the son of the richest man in Taiwan, and he ran the biggest plastics company in the world, Formosa Plastics, Winston Wong. So at the end of the interview, I asked Winston, "Do you ever see the movie The Graduate?" He smiled and said, "Yeah, I've seen The Graduate." His English was really good. And so what would you tell a graduate? He said, "I would tell them to follow the Tao." And I was really taken with that answer. And so we kept talking. I started talking about what I was interested in doing. He said, "You know, this might be my last interview. If I get this money from the Guggenheim, I'm going to go to China to find people like Coal Mountain and Stonehouse, see whether that was a literary conceit or whether there really are people like that." He says, "That's great. If they don't give you the money, I will." 2 weeks later, I called them up. And so I went to China to see whether, again, because you can read poetry, and just because someone writes a great poem doesn't mean they're a great person. Sometimes the poetry elevates them. They reach a higher state through poetry. Anyway, there really were people like that. I mean, I never ran into any poets like that. I ran into people like that. They were the same. They were just like Coal Mountain and Stonehouse. They had let things go, and they were remaking their lives in a very simple fashion. That's why they're in the mountain. They're there. Poets, the hermits go up, just like our graduate students. Most hermits in China go in the mountains about 3 to 5 years, and what they're looking for is their voice. They're looking for their voice, and you can tell if someone is repeating what their teacher taught them, or whether it's what they got out of their own experience, whether it's their voice. And when they have their voice, they go down. They go become teachers. And if you study the biographies of any modern or even ancient Chinese master, Taoist, Buddhist, doesn't matter, they've all had this experience of going away for a while to find that voice, to cut through all the other kind of language that they've heard from other people, including their own teachers. So I've been affected by that myself, because I run into these people. They're not literary conceits. They're just people who really, and they're not making a big deal about it either. They're just, this is the way they've chosen, and they're the poorest people I've ever met, and yet they're so rich, and they smile so much. So I tend to smile a lot too. So maybe that's my practice. I'm better at smiling.
Great. That's perfect for the final question. This is somebody named Nancy. Could you describe one of your meetings with a present-day hermit?
One of my meetings?
Yeah. Could you describe one of your meetings with a present-day hermit?
Well, you never know what they're going to be like, because it's all idiosyncratic. Like the cover of my book, there's the picture of Yuan Zhao meditating, 80-year-old nun, Buddhist nun. You usually become a hermit at the beginning, as a graduate student, kind of that phase when you're like 30s or something. She became a hermit in her 70s. After she had founded 3 Buddhist colleges, she was ending her life as a hermit. She kept saying, I can't wait for the fire. I just can't wait for the fire. And so the last time I saw her alive, there was another young Chinese monk had come to pay his respects, and she told both of us to get under the blanket with her. And we all got under her blanket, big blankets, and she taught us a mantra. in case we ever were about to die, we had injured, sick or something, taught us this mantra. And she said, well, you might get sick, but then you might get well. And so you have to have the antidote mantra too. Otherwise you'll die. Once you start the mantra, then, it's too late. But so she taught us the antidote mantra too. And we spent like an hour or so under her blanket, because she was a tantric teacher. And so me and the monk, we both, later that morning, we had a 2-hour hike to get back down the mountain. The whole way, we're just doing, first mantra, second mantra, death mantra, antidote mantra, death mantra, antidote mantra. And we really had him down there. So we were dying, not so fast. Dying, not so fast. So these people have a lot of fun. Okay.
Thank you, Red Pine.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks again, Red Pine. Really terrific. And thank you, everybody, for turning out tonight. And I know a few people may have brought books they wanted Bill to sign, so I'm going to give permission for you to approach him. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Bill.